5 years ago, Mark Sullivan, a 42-year-old accountant from Seattle, vanished without a trace during a routine workday from his home office in July 2020. His disappearance plunged his wife Sarah and their 2 children into an unimaginable tragedy, while his colleagues and the entire community were left bewildered by the mystery. The police explored multiple theories but failed to solve the case, causing outrage among Mark's family, who never lost hope and continued fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here, we reopen archived cases with respect and evidence. It was July 15th, 2020, a Tuesday that started like any other during the pandemic lockdown. Mark Sullivan had been working from home for 4 months, adapting to the new reality like millions of Americans. His home office, a converted spare bedroom on the 2nd floor of their suburban Seattle house, had become his professional sanctuary. The morning began with the usual routine: coffee at 7 a.m., brief chat with Sarah before she headed to her essential worker job at the hospital, and settling into his desk by 8:30 a.m. sharp. Mark's colleagues at Pinnacle Financial Services described him as methodical and reliable. He attended the 9 a.m. virtual team meeting via video conference, appearing normal and engaged. He discussed quarterly reports, asked about client portfolios, and even made a joke about his wife's sourdough baking experiments. Nothing seemed amiss. The meeting ended at 9:45 a.m., and Mark mentioned he had back-to-back client calls scheduled until noon. But at 11:17 a.m., something unprecedented happened. Mark's computer showed him as away on all company platforms. His scheduled 11:30 a.m. client call went unanswered. By noon, his supervisor, Janet Morrison, tried calling his personal phone. It went straight to voicemail. When Mark missed his 2 p.m. department meeting without any explanation, alarm bells began ringing. Sarah received the call from Janet at 2:30 p.m. Her initial reaction was disbelief, then worry. Mark was the most punctual person she knew. He would never simply vanish from work without explanation. Racing home from the hospital, Sarah found the house exactly as she'd left it that morning, except for one chilling detail. Mark's home office chair was still warm, his computer logged in, and a half-finished email to a client remained on his screen, the cursor blinking as if he'd simply stepped away for a moment. The police arrived at 6 p.m. Detective Ray Coleman, a veteran investigator with the Seattle Police Department, initially treated it as a routine missing person case. "Adults disappear voluntarily all the time," he explained to Sarah. "The stress of pandemic isolation, financial pressures, family responsibilities, it all adds up. Maybe Mark just needed space." But as hours turned into days and days into weeks, it became clear this was no ordinary disappearance. The investigation revealed disturbing inconsistencies. Mark's car remained in the garage, keys hanging on their usual hook. His wallet, credit cards, and identification were still in his bedroom dresser. Bank records showed no unusual transactions. His phone, found under his desk, had no recent calls except work-related ones. The front and back doors showed no signs of forced entry, and neighbor security cameras captured no unusual activity around the Sullivan house that morning. What troubled investigators most was the digital footprint, or lack thereof. Mark's computer showed he was actively working until 11:17 a.m. His last keystroke was typing, "I'll review the Henderson account and get back to..." The sentence remained unfinished, as if he'd been interrupted mid-thought. IT specialists at Pinnacle confirmed no one else had accessed his computer remotely. The timestamps were accurate, and all login credentials matched Mark's typical patterns. Sarah's world collapsed as weeks turned into months. The police investigation grew cold, with Detective Coleman eventually concluding that Mark had likely staged his own disappearance. The evidence, he argued, suggested someone who wanted to vanish without being traced. The missing man's clean record, stable marriage, and loving relationship with his children contradicted this theory, but without concrete evidence of foul play, the case was eventually archived. The community rallied around the Sullivan family initially, but as time passed and no new leads emerged, the case faded from public memory. Sarah refused to accept the police's conclusion. She hired private investigators, organized search parties, and maintained active social media campaigns. Her children, Emma and Jake, then 12 and 10, struggled to understand why their father would abandon them. The psychological toll was devastating, with family therapy sessions becoming a weekly necessity. As 2020 ended and 2021 began, the Mark Sullivan case became another cold file in Seattle's missing persons database. But Sarah's determination never wavered. She kept Mark's home office exactly as he'd left it, convinced that one day the truth would emerge from the digital silence that had swallowed her husband. The investigation into Mark Sullivan's disappearance revealed a complex web of digital evidence that both puzzled and frustrated law enforcement. Detective Coleman's team, working alongside FBI cybercrime specialists, discovered that Mark's online presence had become a maze of contradictory signals in the days leading up to his vanishing. Mark's work computer contained months of seemingly normal activity, but forensic analysis revealed subtle anomalies. His browsing history showed routine financial websites, client portals, and work-related research. However, buried within the data logs, investigators found something peculiar. Mark had been receiving automated system notifications from a defunct company server that had supposedly been decommissioned in 2019. The IT department at Pinnacle Financial Services couldn't explain these phantom notifications. The server in question had been part of a merger that fell through, and its systems were allegedly scrapped. Yet Mark's computer showed regular pings from this non-existent network, occurring primarily during his lunch breaks over a 6-week period before his disappearance. Sarah provided investigators with Mark's personal devices, hoping they might contain clues. His laptop showed he'd been researching unusual topics in his free time, articles about corporate espionage, identity theft, and surprisingly, several deep dives into missing persons cases similar to his own future situation. The search history painted a picture of a man who might have been researching how to disappear, or how others had vanished. But Sarah knew her husband. Mark wasn't planning an escape. He was methodical by nature, always preparing for potential scenarios. She believed he'd stumbled onto something that put him in danger, and his research was an attempt to understand the threat he was facing. The most disturbing discovery came from Mark's smartphone data recovery. Deleted text messages, recovered by FBI technicians, showed he'd been communicating with an unknown number using an encrypted messaging app. The conversations were brief and cryptic. The files you mentioned need verification. Meeting location changed. Same time. They know about the discrepancies. The unknown number was traced to a burner phone purchased with cash in downtown Seattle, activated 3 days before Mark's disappearance. The phone's location data showed it had been in the vicinity of Pinnacle Financial Services building multiple times, but its last known location was near Seattle's waterfront. Then nothing. Detective Coleman's team interviewed every Pinnacle employee, searching for connections to the mysterious contact. Janet Morrison, Mark's supervisor, revealed that Mark had mentioned concerns about irregularities in certain client accounts. He'd requested permission to conduct an internal audit, but had been told to focus on his regular duties. This revelation shifted the investigation's focus toward potential corporate malfeasance. The company's executives initially cooperated, providing access to Mark's work files and client portfolios. However, their cooperation became limited when investigators requested information about the defunct server that had been communicating with Mark's computer. Legal departments became involved, citing client confidentiality and proprietary information concerns. Meanwhile, Sarah discovered her own digital breadcrumbs. Mark had been using their shared cloud storage account to back up files she'd never seen before. Folders with names like safety net and insurance policy contained encrypted documents that even FBI specialists couldn't crack without the proper passwords. The timestamps showed Mark had been uploading these files for weeks before his disappearance, always during late-night hours when Sarah was asleep. The investigation took another turn when neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles parked near the Sullivan home in the weeks preceding Mark's disappearance. Security footage from nearby houses showed a black sedan with obscured license plates appearing multiple times, usually staying for brief periods. The pattern suggested surveillance, but the vehicle's occupants were never clearly visible. Financial analysis of the Sullivan family's accounts revealed Mark had been moving small amounts of money into a previously unknown savings account. The transactions were modest, $200, $300 monthly, but they'd been occurring for over a year. Sarah had no knowledge of this account, and when investigators tried to trace it, they discovered it had been closed on July 14, 2020, one day before Mark's disappearance. The account's closure had been initiated remotely, and all funds had been transferred to an offshore account that proved untraceable. As the digital investigation deepened, a troubling picture emerged. Mark Sullivan hadn't simply vanished. He'd been methodically preparing for something. Whether that something was his own disappearance or protection from an unknown threat remained unclear. The evidence suggested both possibilities, creating a paradox that frustrated investigators and tormented his family. The case file grew thicker, but answers remained elusive. Each digital breadcrumb led to more questions, and the truth about what happened to Mark Sullivan seemed to slip further away with each passing month. 6 months after Mark Sullivan's disappearance, the investigation took a darker turn when Detective Coleman received an unexpected call from a whistleblower within Pinnacle Financial Services. The caller, who identified himself only as a concerned employee, claimed that Mark had discovered something that threatened powerful people within the company's upper management. The anonymous tip led investigators to examine Pinnacle's corporate structure more closely. What they found was a labyrinthine network of subsidiary companies, offshore partnerships, and shell corporations that made tracking financial flows nearly impossible. Mark, with his meticulous nature and accounting expertise, had apparently been piecing together a puzzle that others wanted to keep hidden. Sarah's private investigator, a former FBI agent named Patricia Hayes, had been conducting her own parallel investigation. Hayes discovered that several of Mark's clients were connected to companies that existed only on paper. These shell corporations had been funneling money through Pinnacle's accounts in patterns that suggested money laundering or tax evasion on a massive scale. The defunct server that had been communicating with Mark's computer proved to be the key to understanding the scope of the operation. Hayes traced the server's original purpose to a legitimate company called Meridian Holdings, which had been acquired by Pinnacle in 2018. But instead of being decommissioned, the server had been repurposed for a shadow accounting system that processed transactions for clients who didn't officially exist in Pinnacle's main database. Mark's encrypted files, still locked away in the family's cloud storage, likely contained evidence of this shadow system. The FBI's cybercrime unit worked tirelessly to crack the encryption, but Mark had used sophisticated security measures that suggested he knew his life might depend on keeping the information secret. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Emma, Mark's daughter, now 13 and struggling with her father's absence, remembered a conversation she'd had with him about passwords. Mark had taught her about creating secure passwords using personal memories that only family members would know. Using combinations of family birthdays, anniversaries, and inside jokes, Sarah and the FBI team finally cracked one of the encrypted folders. What they found was explosive. Mark had documented months of suspicious transactions, client meetings that never appeared on official calendars, and correspondence with individuals who didn't exist in any public records. He'd identified a systematic operation that was using Pinnacle's legitimate financial services as a front for laundering money from various illegal enterprises. The documents revealed that Mark had been unknowingly processing transactions for organized crime syndicates, drug cartels, and corrupt political figures. When he began noticing patterns and asking questions, his supervisors had attempted to reassign him to different accounts. But Mark's analytical mind had already connected too many dots. One document, dated just 3 days before his disappearance, was particularly chilling. It was a draft email to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, detailing everything Mark had discovered. The email was never sent, suggesting that Mark had been intercepted before he could expose the operation. Detective Coleman's investigation now had a clear motive, but identifying the perpetrators remained challenging. The corporate structure of Pinnacle was so complex that determining who had authority over the shadow accounting system required forensic accounting experts and federal prosecutors. The case was quietly transferred to a joint task force involving the FBI, IRS, and Seattle Police Department. Sarah's world shifted again as she realized her husband hadn't abandoned his family. He'd been protecting them. The man she'd married, the father of her children, had stumbled onto something that cost him everything. The police theory of voluntary disappearance crumbled under the weight of evidence showing Mark had been caught between his conscience and people who would kill to protect their secrets. The investigation's focus turned to identifying Mark's mysterious contact, the person who'd been communicating through encrypted messages. Phone records and surveillance footage suggested this individual had been helping Mark document the illegal activities, possibly someone else within Pinnacle who'd also discovered the truth. As 2021 progressed, the federal investigation expanded beyond Mark's disappearance. Several high-ranking Pinnacle executives were placed under surveillance, and search warrants were prepared for company facilities. But the corporate lawyers fought every subpoena, claiming client privilege and threatening to expose legitimate clients to protect the criminal ones. The complexity of the case meant that finding Mark Sullivan, alive or dead, became secondary to building a federal case against the money laundering operation. Sarah watched helplessly as her husband's disappearance became a footnote in a larger investigation that might take years to resolve. Meanwhile, the Sullivan family struggled with a new reality. Mark hadn't chosen to leave them, but he might never return. The truth about his disappearance was emerging, but justice remained elusive, and the possibility of ever seeing him again grew dimmer with each passing day. As 2022 began, the Joint Federal Task Force investigating Mark Sullivan's disappearance and the Pinnacle Financial Services money laundering operation faced a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating for nearly a decade. The investigation revealed that Mark's case was not isolated. He was likely the third Pinnacle employee to disappear under suspicious circumstances over the past 5 years. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos, now leading the investigation, discovered that 2 other employees had left the company under mysterious circumstances. Thomas Chen, a senior analyst, had allegedly committed suicide in 2018, jumping from the Aurora Bridge. His death was ruled suicide, despite his family's insistence that Tom had no history of depression and had recently expressed concerns about irregularities at work. The second case involved Rebecca Martinez, a compliance officer who had reportedly suffered a nervous breakdown in 2019 and voluntarily committed herself to a psychiatric facility. However, when Agent Santos attempted to interview Martinez, she discovered that the woman had checked out of the facility after just 2 weeks and hadn't been seen since. Her family believed she'd been forcibly medicated and possibly relocated against her will. The pattern was becoming clear. Pinnacle had been systematically silencing employees who discovered their illegal operations. Mark Sullivan's disappearance fit perfectly into this pattern, but his case was different because he'd been more careful about documenting his discoveries and protecting the evidence. Sarah Sullivan had become an unwitting partner in the federal investigation. Her persistence in keeping Mark's case alive had provided investigators with crucial evidence they might never have discovered otherwise. Agent Santos worked closely with Sarah, using her knowledge of Mark's habits and thinking patterns to decode more of his encrypted files. The breakthrough came when they cracked Mark's insurance policy folder. Inside were audio recordings, hours of secretly recorded conversations between Mark and his supervisors, client meetings, and phone calls that revealed the scope of the criminal operation. Mark had been wearing a wire of sorts, using his smartphone to record conversations whenever he suspected illegal activity was being discussed. One recording, made just 5 days before his disappearance, captured a heated conversation between Mark and Janet Morrison, his supervisor. Morrison could be heard threatening Mark's career and family if he continued pursuing his unauthorized investigation. The conversation ended with Morrison saying, "Some things are bigger than one person's conscience, Mark. Think about Emma and Jake before you make any stupid decisions." The audio evidence transformed the investigation. Morrison was arrested and charged with conspiracy and witness intimidation. Under pressure from federal prosecutors, she agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed that the money laundering operation was controlled by a consortium of international criminal organizations that had purchased influence within Pinnacle through strategic investments and board appointments. Morrison's cooperation led to the identification of the mysterious contact who'd been communicating with Mark. David Kim, a senior IT specialist at Pinnacle, had also discovered the shadow accounting system and had been secretly helping Mark document the evidence. Kim had managed to avoid suspicion by maintaining his normal work routines while covertly gathering information, but Kim's luck had run out on July 15, 2020. According to Morrison's testimony, security footage showed Kim entering the Pinnacle building that morning, but he never appeared on any internal cameras after 10:30 a.m. His keycard showed he'd accessed a restricted server room, but he was never seen leaving. Kim's disappearance had occurred simultaneously with Mark's, suggesting a coordinated operation to eliminate both whistleblowers. The server room Kim had accessed contained the physical hardware for the shadow accounting system. When FBI agents finally obtained warrants to search the facility, they found evidence that the servers had been hastily wiped and physically damaged. However, digital forensics experts were able to recover fragments of data that corroborated Mark's documented discoveries. Agent Santos's team worked around the clock to map the criminal network. The money laundering operation involved dozens of shell companies, corrupt bank officials, and criminal enterprises spanning 3 continents. The amounts being processed were staggering. Over $2 billion had been laundered through Pinnacle systems over 8 years. Sarah Sullivan found herself at the center of a federal investigation that had grown far beyond her husband's disappearance. The FBI provided protection for her family, as the criminal network had demonstrated their willingness to eliminate threats. Emma and Jake were assigned security details for their school activities, and the family was relocated to a safe house while the investigation continued. The question that haunted everyone involved was whether Mark Sullivan and David Kim were still alive. Morrison's testimony suggested they might have been relocated rather than killed, as their deaths would have attracted too much attention. The criminal organization preferred to make problems disappear quietly, keeping their victims alive but isolated and controlled. As winter 2022 approached, Agent Santos's team prepared for a massive coordinated operation to dismantle the criminal network. But they faced a sobering reality. Even if they succeeded in destroying the money laundering operation, finding Mark Sullivan and David Kim would require a different kind of investigation, one that might lead them into an underground world where disappeared persons were kept alive but forever separated from their families. The federal investigation into Mark Sullivan's disappearance reached a chilling revelation in early 2023 when Agent Santos's team uncovered evidence of what they termed corporate kidnapping, a systematic method of silencing whistleblowers by making them disappear into a network of controlled facilities that existed outside normal legal oversight. Through Morrison's continued cooperation and digital forensics, investigators discovered that the criminal organization had established what essentially amounted to private prisons disguised as psychiatric facilities, rehabilitation centers, and wellness retreats. These facilities housed individuals who posed threats to various criminal enterprises, keeping them alive but completely isolated from the outside world. The breakthrough came when FBI agents raided a seemingly legitimate mental health facility in rural Oregon called Serenity Pines Recovery Center. The facility's records showed they specialized in treating executive burnout and corporate stress disorders, but investigators found evidence of patients being held against their will and subjected to experimental psychiatric treatments designed to suppress memory and cognitive function. Among the facility's records, buried in coded patient files, agents found references to two individuals matching the descriptions of Mark Sullivan and David Kim. The records indicated they'd been admitted in July 2020 under false identities, diagnosed with acute paranoid episodes and delusional disorder related to workplace stress. Sarah Sullivan accompanied Agent Santos to Oregon, hoping for the first concrete lead about her husband's fate in nearly 3 years. The facility had been hastily evacuated when federal agents arrived, but they found evidence of recent occupation, rooms that matched the psychological profiles of both missing men, medication schedules that suggested chemical restraint rather than treatment, and most importantly, a hidden cache of personal items that included Mark's wedding ring and David Kim's distinctive watch. The discovery that Mark might still be alive sent shockwaves through the investigation and renewed hope for the Sullivan family. However, the facility's staff and patients had vanished, suggesting the criminal network had early warning systems that allowed them to relocate their operations when law enforcement got too close. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a forensic psychiatrist consulted by the FBI, explained the horrifying sophistication of the operation. The facilities use a combination of pharmaceutical interventions and psychological manipulation to create what she termed living ghosts, individuals who remained physically healthy but were rendered psychologically incapable of remembering their past lives or communicating coherently about their experiences. The investigation revealed that this network operated at least 12 similar facilities across the United States, all connected through a web of shell companies and foreign investments. Each facility specialized in different methods of control. Some focused on pharmaceutical suppression, others used isolation and sensory deprivation, and the most sophisticated employed experimental techniques that bordered on mind control. Agent Santos's team worked with international law enforcement to trace the network's global connections. They discovered similar operations in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and South America, all designed to make inconvenient individuals disappear without the messy complications of murder. The criminal organization had created a systematic solution to the problem of witnesses and whistleblowers. Sarah Sullivan struggled with the implications of these discoveries. The knowledge that Mark might be alive but potentially irreversibly damaged was almost worse than believing he was dead. She spent sleepless nights wondering what 3 years of captivity and psychological manipulation might have done to the man she'd married. The FBI launched coordinated raids on 6 facilities simultaneously, hoping to prevent the network from relocating all their captives. The results were mixed. They rescued 37 individuals who'd been reported missing over the past decade, but found evidence that dozens more had been moved to unknown locations just hours before the raids. Among the rescued individuals were 3 former financial industry employees who discovered money laundering operations at their respective companies. Their testimonies provided crucial evidence about the network's methods, but their psychological states varied dramatically. Some retained clear memories of their experiences, while others seemed permanently damaged by their captivity. The rescued individuals described a systematized approach to breaking down identity and memory. New arrivals were isolated, subjected to sleep deprivation, and given cocktails of psychiatric medications that impaired cognitive function. Over time, captives lost the ability to distinguish between reality and induced hallucinations, making them incapable of providing coherent testimony about their experiences. If this case has already captured your attention, hit the like button. It helps Mark Sullivan's story reach more people. As 2023 progressed, the investigation expanded into an international manhunt for the remaining facilities and their captives. Agent Santos worked with Interpol and foreign intelligence agencies to identify locations where Mark Sullivan and David Kim might be held. The search led them across continents, following financial trails and communication intercepts that suggested the network was far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had initially imagined. The Sullivan family faced an agonizing weight, knowing that Mark might be alive but possibly beyond rescue, held in a system designed to erase his very identity while keeping his body breathing. The search for Mark Sullivan and David Kim led Agent Santos and her international task force into a complex web of criminal enterprises that spanned multiple continents. By mid-2023, investigators had identified the network's operational centers in Romania, Thailand, and Argentina, each serving different functions in what had become known as the Ghost Protocol, a systematic method of disappearing individuals who posed threats to organized crime. The Romanian facility, hidden within a legitimate pharmaceutical research complex in the Carpathian Mountains, specialized in experimental memory suppression techniques. Intelligence gathered through intercepted communications suggested that high-value captives like Mark and David were likely held at this location, as it offered the most sophisticated methods of psychological control, combined with complete isolation from international oversight. Sarah Sullivan found herself at the center of an international diplomatic crisis. The Romanian government initially denied knowledge of any illegal facilities within their borders, but evidence provided by the FBI task force forced them to acknowledge the existence of the operation. However, by the time Romanian special forces raided the mountain complex, they found only empty rooms and evidence of hasty evacuation. The discovery that shook the investigation to its core came from Thailand. A raid on a facility disguised as a meditation retreat rescued 12 captives, including 2 Americans, who'd been missing for over 5 years. Among the rescued was Rebecca Martinez, the Pinnacle compliance officer who'd supposedly had a nervous breakdown in 2019. Martinez's testimony provided the first eyewitness account of the network's methods and confirmed that Mark Sullivan and David Kim had indeed been captured alive. She described seeing both men at the Oregon facility in late 2020 before being transferred to Thailand herself. According to Martinez, Mark had been resistant to the psychological treatments and had been scheduled for transfer to what guards called the Romanian program. The rescued captives underwent extensive medical and psychological evaluation at a secure facility in Virginia. Dr. Warren's team discovered that while the physical health of most captives had been maintained, the psychological damage varied dramatically. Some individuals retained clear memories despite their ordeal, while others showed signs of severe dissociative disorders that might never fully heal. Martinez, despite her trauma, provided crucial intelligence about the network's structure. She described a rotation system where captives were moved between facilities every 6 to 12 months, to prevent them from forming relationships or gathering too much information about their location. The system was designed to maintain psychological disorientation while preventing any single facility from becoming overloaded with captives. The breakthrough in the international investigation came from an unexpected source. David Kim's younger brother, a cybersecurity expert who'd been conducting his own investigation, managed to hack into communication systems used by the criminal network. His discoveries revealed real-time coordination between facilities and, most importantly, current locations of high-priority captives. The hacked communications showed that Mark Sullivan was indeed being held at a facility in rural Argentina, operated under the cover of a private alcohol rehabilitation center called Esperanza Nueva. The facility's isolation in the Patagonian countryside made it nearly impossible to approach without detection, but satellite imagery confirmed the presence of high-security features inconsistent with a legitimate treatment center. Agent Santos coordinated with Argentine Federal Police to plan a rescue operation. However, the complexity of international law enforcement cooperation meant that months of preparation were required before any action could be taken. During this delay, intercepted communications suggested that the network was planning to relocate their highest-value captives to an even more secure location. Sarah Sullivan made the difficult decision to travel to Argentina, hoping that her presence might expedite the rescue operation. The FBI initially opposed her involvement, but her intimate knowledge of Mark's psychological profile proved valuable in planning the approach to a man who'd been subjected to 3 years of psychological manipulation. The Argentine facility, when finally located through aerial reconnaissance, proved to be more heavily fortified than expected. The complex included underground sections that didn't appear on any official blueprints, suggesting the criminal network had extensively modified the legitimate rehabilitation center. Thermal imaging revealed approximately 30 individuals within the complex, but identifying specific captives proved impossible from external observation. Dr. Warren prepared psychological profiles to help rescuers identify Mark Sullivan and David Kim, but she warned that 3 years of captivity and potential chemical treatments might have significantly altered their personalities and cognitive function. The men they rescued might bear little resemblance to the individuals who disappeared in 2020. The rescue operation, codenamed Digital Ghost, was scheduled for early dawn on October 15, 2023. Argentine special forces, supported by FBI agents and medical personnel, prepared for what might be the most complex hostage rescue operation in the investigation's history. The goal was not just to rescue the captives, but to preserve evidence that could finally bring down the entire international network. As the operation approached, Sarah Sullivan faced the possibility that the man they rescued might not be the Mark she remembered. 3 years of captivity could have changed him in ways that might make a normal life impossible. But after nearly 4 years of searching, she was finally going to learn the truth about what happened to her husband. The night before the rescue operation, Sarah stood in her hotel room in Buenos Aires, looking at a photograph of Mark from their last family vacation in 2019. Tomorrow, she would discover whether the man she'd never stopped loving still existed somewhere within whatever they found at Esperanza Nueva. At 4:47 a.m. on October 15, 2023, Argentine Special Forces units surrounded the Esperanza Nueva facility in coordinated formation, while FBI agents and medical personnel waited at a secure distance. Agent Santos maintained radio contact with all units as the operation she'd been planning for months finally commenced. Sarah Sullivan waited at a nearby medical facility, her heart pounding as she listened to radio chatter that would determine her family's future. The initial breach revealed the facility's true nature immediately. What appeared to be a standard rehabilitation center from the outside contained sophisticated security systems, reinforced doors, and surveillance equipment that belonged in a maximum security prison rather than a treatment facility. The underground sections, accessed through hidden passages, housed individual cells designed for psychological isolation and control. The first rescued captive was David Kim, found in a basement cell in a state of severe malnutrition and psychological disorientation. Kim initially couldn't speak coherently, responding only to direct questions with single words or phrases. Medical personnel immediately began assessment, while agents searched for additional captives throughout the complex. Mark Sullivan was discovered in what appeared to be the facility's most secure section, a specially modified cell equipped with monitoring equipment and what Dr. Warren later identified as devices used for sleep deprivation and sensory manipulation. When Argentine officers first approached, Mark didn't respond to his name and seemed unable to focus on faces or voices. The man Sarah had been searching for more than 3 years was physically recognizable but psychologically transformed. Mark had lost approximately 40 pounds, his hair had gone completely grey, and his eyes showed the vacant expression that medical personnel associated with prolonged psychological trauma. Most concerning was his apparent inability to recognize his own name or respond to questions about his identity. Dr. Warren, who accompanied the rescue team, conducted preliminary assessments at the scene. Mark showed signs of what she termed induced dissociative identity disorder. His personality had been systematically fragmented through pharmaceutical intervention and psychological manipulation. He responded to different names at different times and seemed to believe he'd been at the facility voluntarily for treatment of unspecified mental health issues. The facility's records, recovered during the raid, revealed the horrifying sophistication of the psychological control program. Mark had been subjected to daily injections of experimental psychiatric medications, forced sleep schedules designed to disrupt natural brain function, and exposure to what the records called reality restructuring therapy, a process designed to replace authentic memories with manufactured ones. Sarah's first reunion with Mark took place at the secure medical facility in Buenos Aires under carefully controlled conditions. Dr. Warren had warned her that Mark might not recognize her and could potentially react with fear or aggression to unfamiliar stimuli. The meeting was heartbreaking. Mark looked at Sarah with polite confusion, as if meeting a stranger who claimed to know him. The medical evaluation revealed that while Mark's physical health could be restored with proper nutrition and care, the psychological damage was extensive. His memories of life before 2020 existed in fragments that he couldn't organize into coherent narratives. He remembered Emma and Jake as names that seemed familiar, but couldn't connect them to specific relationships or experiences. David Kim's condition, while also severe, showed signs of potential recovery. He retained more coherent memories and could discuss his capture and captivity with some accuracy. Kim's testimony provided crucial evidence about the facility's operations and confirmed that both men had been kept alive specifically because killing them would have created too much law enforcement attention. The rescued captives, 31 individuals in total, represented one of the largest hostage recoveries in modern law enforcement history. The group included missing persons from 6 countries, all individuals who'd posed threats to various criminal enterprises. Their testimonies began painting a picture of an international network that had been operating for over 2 decades. Mark's recovery process began immediately, but progress was slow and uncertain. Dr. Warren explained that the combination of pharmaceutical manipulation and psychological conditioning had created what she termed artificial amnesia. Mark's memories weren't destroyed, but his ability to access and organize them had been severely compromised. Sarah faced an agonizing decision: How to help a husband who didn't remember being married, children who'd grown up believing their father had abandoned them, and a life that might never return to normal. Emma and Jake, now 16 and 14, struggled to understand that the man they'd been told was their father bore little resemblance to the person they remembered. The international investigation continued as agents worked to identify and shut down the remaining facilities in the network. The evidence gathered from Esperanza Nueva revealed that the operation was far larger than anyone had imagined, with tentacles reaching into legitimate businesses, government agencies, and international criminal organizations across 4 continents. For the Sullivan family, Mark's rescue marked the beginning of a new kind of ordeal. They'd found him alive, but the man they'd recovered might never fully return to being the person they'd lost. The reunion they'd dreamed about for 3 years became the start of a different kind of struggle, learning to love and rebuild relationships with someone who'd been fundamentally changed by his experience. As 2023 ended, Mark Sullivan remained in specialized treatment, slowly beginning to recover fragments of his identity while his family learned to navigate a new reality they'd never imagined possible. 6 months after Mark Sullivan's rescue from the Argentine facility, the slow process of rebuilding a shattered life began in earnest. Dr. Warren's team at the Specialized Trauma Recovery Center in Virginia had made unprecedented progress in understanding the effects of prolonged psychological manipulation, but Mark's case remained one of the most complex they'd ever encountered. The breakthrough in Mark's recovery came from an unexpected source: his own meticulous nature. Despite 3 years of psychological conditioning designed to erase his identity, Mark had unconsciously retained his analytical thinking patterns. Dr. Warren discovered that while his emotional memories had been severely damaged, his procedural memories, the ways he approached problems and organized information, remained largely intact. Sarah had relocated the family to Virginia to be near the treatment facility, a decision that forced Emma and Jake to leave their friends and schools behind. The teenagers struggled with resentment toward a father they barely recognized who had upended their lives once again. Family therapy sessions became battlegrounds where old grief mixed with new frustrations. The most difficult challenge was Mark's inability to form new emotional connections. While he gradually began to remember facts about his previous life, his job, his address, even specific conversations, he couldn't access the feelings associated with those memories. He knew intellectually that Sarah was his wife and Emma and Jake were his children, but the emotional bonds that had defined their relationships seemed permanently severed. Mark's recovery was complicated by his growing awareness of what had been done to him. As his cognitive function improved, he began to understand the scope of his captivity and the systematic destruction of his personality. This awareness triggered severe depression and anxiety, requiring careful management with medications and therapy. The legal proceedings related to the international criminal network provided both closure and additional trauma for the Sullivan family. Mark's testimony, delivered via video link to protect his psychological stability, was crucial in convicting dozens of individuals involved in the kidnapping and money laundering operations. However, the process of recounting his experiences repeatedly re-traumatized him and slowed his recovery. Sarah found herself grieving a loss that wasn't quite a death and celebrating a reunion that wasn't quite a return. The man sleeping beside her looked like Mark and increasingly sounded like Mark, but the emotional intimacy they'd shared seemed irretrievably lost. Marriage counseling helped them navigate this new relationship, but it required accepting that they were essentially starting over as strangers. Emma and Jake's reactions to their father's return evolved slowly. Emma, now 17, initially rejected any relationship with Mark, angry at the years of uncertainty and the disruption his return had caused. Jake, more open to connection, tried to build new memories with his father, but struggled with the absence of the emotional warmth he remembered from childhood. The breakthrough came during a family therapy session in spring 2024. Mark, working with Dr. Warren's team, had been practicing exercises designed to stimulate emotional memory through sensory triggers. When Sarah brought in a recording of him reading bedtime stories to the children from years earlier, Mark had his first authentic emotional response since his rescue. Tears that he couldn't explain, but that connected him to feelings he'd forgotten he'd lost. This moment marked the beginning of true recovery rather than mere rehabilitation. Mark's emotional responses began returning gradually, like feeling returning to a limb after numbness. He couldn't fully access his past emotional life, but he could begin forming new emotional connections with his family based on their current reality rather than trying to recreate what had been lost. The financial recovery proved easier than the emotional healing. The federal government's prosecution of Pinnacle Financial Services and related entities resulted in substantial settlements for victims' families. The Sullivan family received compensation that ensured Mark wouldn't need to return to work while he recovered, allowing him to focus entirely on rebuilding his life and relationships. Mark's case became a landmark study in recovery from prolonged psychological manipulation. Dr. Warren published research based on his treatment that would help other victims of similar crimes, but Mark struggled with being reduced to a case study when he was still fighting to reclaim his identity as a person. By late 2024, Mark had progressed enough to live at home with his family, though he continued intensive therapy and medical monitoring. He'd developed coping strategies for the gaps in his emotional memory and had begun to form new bonds with Sarah, Emma, and Jake that weren't based on their shared past, but on their commitment to a shared future. The man who returned to the Sullivan family wasn't the same person who disappeared in 2020. But he was becoming someone new, someone shaped by trauma, but not defined by it, someone learning to love his family again while they learned to love the person he was becoming. The investigation that had begun with Mark's disappearance ultimately dismantled an international criminal network responsible for hundreds of disappearances over 2 decades. But for the Sullivan family, the real victory was quieter and more personal. Learning that love could survive even the systematic destruction of identity and memory. 5 years after Mark Sullivan first vanished from his home office during a routine workday, an extraordinary event occurred that would provide the final chapter in one of the most complex missing persons cases in modern history. On July 15, 2025, exactly 5 years to the day after his disappearance, Mark appeared in a virtual company meeting at Pinnacle Financial Services, not as a physical presence, but as a digital ghost that would finally close the circle on his impossible journey. The meeting was routine, a monthly compliance review conducted via video conference. Janet Morrison, who had served her sentence and been released on probation, was not present, but many of Mark's former colleagues participated in what had become a memorial tradition, conducting the July 15th meeting in remembrance of their vanished co-worker. At 11:17 a.m., the exact time Mark had gone missing 5 years earlier, something unprecedented happened. For approximately 30 seconds, Mark's image appeared in the video conference. Not a recording or a photograph, but live video showing Mark as he appeared in 2025, grayer, thinner, but unmistakably present. He seemed to be trying to speak, his mouth moving as if audio was not transmitting properly. The technical impossibility of Mark's appearance created immediate panic among the meeting participants. IT specialists were called, recordings were reviewed, and within hours, the FBI task force that had handled Mark's original case was reassembled. The video showed Mark in what appeared to be his old home office, looking directly at the camera with an expression of urgent desperation. Agent Santos, now promoted but still haunted by the Sullivan case, arrived at the Pinnacle offices within 2 hours. The technical analysis revealed something that defied explanation. Mark's appearance in the meeting wasn't a hack, a recording, or a technical glitch. The video feed had originated from Mark's old IP address, from his home office that had remained untouched since his disappearance. Sarah Sullivan received the call while at work. After 5 years of rebuilding their lives, the family had reached a stable routine. Mark's recovery had progressed to the point where he could function independently, though he still struggled with emotional connections and memory gaps. The news that he'd somehow appeared in a Pinnacle meeting sent shockwaves through their carefully reconstructed world. When investigators arrived at the Sullivan home, they found Mark in his old office for the first time since his rescue. He was sitting at his computer, which showed the Pinnacle meeting still in progress. Mark appeared confused but insistent that he'd been trying to finish what he started and close the loop on his investigation into the money laundering operation. Dr. Warren, called in to assess Mark's mental state, discovered that he'd experienced what she termed a memory breakthrough, a sudden, overwhelming return of suppressed memories triggered by the anniversary of his disappearance. Mark had awakened that morning with complete recall of his investigation, his capture, and his years in captivity. The psychological barriers that had protected him during recovery had suddenly dissolved. Mark's appearance in the Pinnacle meeting wasn't supernatural, it was technological. During his recovery, he'd been unconsciously rebuilding his technical skills while working with occupational therapists. On the anniversary morning, with his memories suddenly restored, he'd accessed his old computer and attempted to rejoin the meeting he'd been forced to abandon 5 years earlier. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone involved. Mark had literally returned to the exact moment and place where his ordeal began, completing a circle that connected his disappearance to his recovery. The 30 seconds of video represented his final testimony, a digital ghost returning to close the case that had consumed so many lives. The investigation's final phase involved Mark providing complete testimony about his experiences, both his original discovery of the money laundering operation and his 3 years in captivity. His recovered memories filled in crucial gaps that helped prosecutors complete their cases against the remaining members of the international criminal network. Mark's digital appearance also provided closure for his former colleagues, many of whom had struggled with guilt about his disappearance. Seeing him alive and attempting to communicate gave them peace that their vanished co-worker had survived his ordeal and was working to ensure justice for the crimes they'd all witnessed. The Sullivan family faced their final test as Mark's complete memory recovery forced them to confront the full reality of what had happened. The man who'd been slowly rebuilding relationships with them was suddenly fully aware of everything he'd lost. His children's childhood, years of marriage, the life that had been stolen from him. But instead of destroying their progress, Mark's memory recovery strengthened their bonds. He could finally understand and appreciate the years of struggle his family had endured and the love that had sustained them through the darkest period of their lives. The emotional connections he'd been rebuilding were suddenly reinforced by his complete understanding of what they meant to each other. The case that had begun with Mark Sullivan's mysterious disappearance during remote work concluded with his voluntary appearance in a virtual meeting, a digital ghost returning from the dead to complete unfinished business. The circle was complete. The accountant who discovered a criminal conspiracy had finally delivered his full testimony, ensuring that justice would be served for all the victims of the international network. On July 15, 2025, Mark Sullivan officially returned to the world not as a victim or a survivor, but as the man who'd helped dismantle one of the most sophisticated criminal operations in modern history. His digital ghost had become flesh again, and his family was whole. Subscribe to our channel to explore more archived and disturbing cases across America. Thank you for following Mark Sullivan's story. See you in the next video. In the end, some disappearances aren't about people choosing to vanish. They're about the courage to expose truth, even when that courage costs everything. Mark Sullivan's 5-year journey from digital ghost to living witness proves that sometimes the most important returns happen not in flesh, but in the completion of a mission that justice demands.